All right.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. I am in the UK and Michael's in New Zealand, so we're sort of divided Free Kiwis. But
You're
we have
the
humans
foreign
here.
correspondent for now.
Right, who's the foreign correspondent? Oh yeah, me, because it's Free Kiwis.
You.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
there's probably however many Kiwis there are in London, thousands of Kiwis in London. So, but anyway,
But not so many Kiwis as there are in Kiwi land.
it still is technically outside the bounds of New Zealand, unless
Yeah,
they decide that they need the UK. New Zealand needs the UK in the way that Trump seems to need Greenland. But
that's true. I'm sure we could invade the UK very successfully.
we'll see. Anyway, so we wanted to do some kind of catch-up episode where we talk about free speech and maybe other things in various places because I've just been on this tremendous voyage through Japan and Turkey, and now I'm in the UK. So maybe we'll start with Turkey and then we'll talk about Britain afterwards. And I want to hear what's going on in New Zealand as well. So
Sure. Yeah.
all right, so maybe we'll start with Turkey because I think it's actually a good thing to talk about because we've done however many episodes we've done now, 50 or 60 episodes about free speech in New Zealand and maybe also in the UK and other places, Anglophone countries. And I think it's always really important to, you know, keep a sense of perspective and proportion here. And we have tried to, I think, in this podcast. Yes, there are serious threats to free speech, academic freedom, etc., in the Anglophone West. But it's also true that the threats to free speech are much greater. In fact, they're not just to free speech, they're sort of regular, egregious violations of free speech. They're much
Mm.
greater in obviously autocratic countries. So I guess Turkey isn't necessarily, I mean, 100% autocratic. I don't think people say it's a kind of completely slam dunk case of a dictatorship. But, President Erdogan's been in power since, I think, soon after the turn of the millennium. And, he seems to be kind of gathering power in all the various institutions.
What
I
what
want to talk
what
about.
what he's done wouldn't have gone down too well with Ataturk, I suspect.
No, exactly. I mean, and I guess from my sort of little experience of Turkish history, you can see modern Turkish history as a kind of dialectic between the sort of Kemalist wing of liberal Republican secularists and this sort of more Muslim, now kind of Muslim majority, centered more in Ankara in central Anatolia, that more conservative strain of Turkish thinking. And really that strain of Turkish thinking, I guess, wants to see Turkey as part of the Islamic world, not quite the Arab world because they're Turks, but yeah, I mean, in some sense, it's part of the Arab world. I mean, of course, before Ataturk, their script was Arabic, and they were much more connect. I mean, the Ottoman Empire sort of did connect up large swathes of.
I doubt that free speech was much of a thing under the Ottomans.
No, I mean, there's probably one of those. It's probably one of those paradoxical things where you probably could get away with a lot in those days because the state didn't really have the power to kind of peep into everybody's bedroom and household and whatever and censor everything. But obviously, yes. I mean, I was in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul where the sultans hung out for hundreds of years, and there were various reminders there that basically the sultans had supreme power. They could just they could just decide to execute you, and that from the Grand Vizier down, So probably if you said,
Not to
I don't
mention
like
all
your
the
turban,
slavery. Not to mention all the slavery.
not to mention the bit of slavery, the sex slavery. I had a very pleasant tour of the harem in Topkapi
Yeah.
Palace. But anyway, I mean that's the past. Obviously, Erdogan hasn't isn't quite a sultan, but he seems to be some kind of autocrat. And I was reading a bit about Islamization, sort of continuing Islamization, or in some sense, sort of like turning back the clock. And this sort of interests me partly because I went to Hagia Sophia or Hagia Sophia, as the Turks call it, the great church that was built in the 6th century AD originally. And then for many years it was a mosque. Then it was a museum, so secular space, which I think was the most appropriate sort of answer. And now
Yeah.
Ataturk in 2020, Ataturk, Erdogan, very good.
Erdogan. Yeah.
Erdogan turned it back into a mosque. And I was reading
You
also
are
that,
still you
yeah,
are
go ahead.
still able to visit, are you? Because I thought that having become a mosque again, it was more difficult to visit. When I went there, it was a museum and
Yeah.
lots of people went through, but you were able to visit with no problems.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, here's the thing. I actually sort of suspected, oh, it's more difficult to visit nowadays. But because I sort of had little there was sort of awkwardnesses. Like the ground floor was closed. You couldn't go to the ground floor and look up at the big dome. You had to sort of be on this. what's the phrase? Sort of middle story. What's the word
The
I'm looking for?
mezzanine.
Yeah, kind of a mezzanine, I guess, around the side. But I actually put that up on social media on X or Twitter, and I said also it was tremendously expensive to go in. Like I had all these sort of, and also there was scaffolding in the center of it, and I was sort of complaining about that, and I sort of semi-suspected that it was because, and it was so much easier to see the Blue Mosque, and the Blue Mosque I think was free to see. It's just across the way, and
Mm.
there's also been a huge history of the Blue Mosque kind of competing with Hagia Sophia. In a sense, it was probably built in order to kind of outdo the Hagia Sophia. But anyway, I put it on Twitter, and people were saying, no, I was there a few years ago after it had been converted into a mosque, and you were able to go to the ground floor. You know, the scaffolding wasn't there. So problems I had were probably more a reflection of just they're doing works at the moment. But anyway, no. So I mean, this Islamization thing in Turkey is real. There might interest you. It has a schools aspect to it, um, and because of course people from any ideology probably think we need to seize the schools, which is why it's so important to keep schools free. Imam Hatip schools apparently is the term for them. They're religious schools in Turkey, and one of the things Erdogan has done is expanded them so that they don't have entrance exams, and other schools do, is my understanding. So basically, if you can't get into any other type of school, they're the sort of default school, and they're sort of explicitly religious schools. And Erdogan has said that the goal of them is to raise a pious generation. So obviously that's fairly worrying. And he's also channeled a lot of resources to the Diyanet, which is the Directorate of Religious Affairs. I don't think it's quite as creepy as the one in Iran has been in the past, where they kind of, you know, until recently in Iran, they were stopping women for not wearing veils and things. I'm not sure if they quite do that in Turkey, but in a secular republic, you shouldn't really have a government-funded Directorate of Religious Affairs. And then there's also been headscarf, interesting sort of headscarf politics, as there is in various other countries as well. But in Turkey, there was a ban of headscarf wearing in public institutions because they wanted to enforce laïcité, as the French would say, you know, the idea of the state as secular. But that apparently is in abeyance, so a lot of people are wearing headscarves now, even working in public institutions. And again, so that sort of, I guess people see that as the state is not just Turkish and Republican, it's Islamic.
Yeah, one thing that I noticed when I visited Istanbul, and I'd be interested to, I mean, this was a good 15 years ago at least. Um, be interesting to know if you found the same, that the character of the city was very different on each side of the Bosphorus. It definitely felt as if on the Asian side you were in a different place than when you were on the European side. And it did occur to me that Turkey is a very interesting country in that way because it has this little corner that's in Europe and it has a European influence through that, but the vast majority of it is in Asia Minor and is perhaps more traditionally Islamic.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I didn't do my homework very well because I didn't actually go to the Asian part. I didn't have much time. I only had 4 days in Turkey. Yeah, I actually just focused on I wanted to focus on the Byzantine bit because that's my interest as an ancient historian. But
Yeah.
I mean, so everything I say has to be taken with a grain of salt in terms of my personal impressions. But I would say that as a traveler, I wanted to go there my whole life, and people have often said to me, "Oh, you know, Istanbul's very different to the rest of not only the Islamic world but Turkey. It's very liberal, you know." And I was almost surprised that they even had the call to prayer. I mean, obviously they did, but I sort of was surprised to hear it for some reason. And I saw a lot of people wearing, a lot of women wearing hijab, but also like a few wearing sort of full burqa type things. And maybe they were from other countries, but I was actually surprised at how Islamic it seemed to me, at least, from the perspective of someone who was sort of expecting this very liberal Kemalist sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably Islamic culture has never had a kind of reformation or a reckoning with civil society in the way that the Christians did in the Renaissance in Europe.
I mean, I'm sure they've gone through their various twists and turns in history, and you know, the Kemalist moment was one example of when an Islamic country did try and modernize in a very sort of westernizing way. But obviously, these things go back and
Yes.
forth. That's one of the interesting things about Iran now as well, and Afghanistan. You know, people post on social media these pictures of Afghanistan, Kabul or Tehran universities in the 70s, and there are all these women with their hair, down long and looks very secular, like normal students in the West. And then there's this sort of, as I say, counter-revolution. I mean, I don't think Erdogan hasn't gone quite as far as, the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran or the Taliban, obviously. But yeah, so there's a bit of a Islamization. And I guess some of that, I don't know how much of that flows into the challenges to free speech in that state at the moment. I mean, I think the problems with free speech in Turkey are more a result of Erdogan just being a bit of an autocrat and a bit of a dictator. Um, so, the press is mostly now under government control. So that obviously, under Erdogan's control effectively. There's an internet law called the Internet Law, capital I, capital L, and there's an Article 9 of that, which has apparently been used to block websites. And at some point, the Constitutional Court in recent years actually overturned that, which is like a rare victory for sort of pluralistic institutions in Turkey. But apparently, it's too early to see whether that'll actually hold, and Erdogan's probably going to sort of overwhelm that or just start ignoring that ban in some way. There are hundreds of journalists in prison. There's a man called Nevsin Mengu who has been prosecuted for interviewing a Kurdish leader, which I think, even by the standards of New Zealand universities, is quite crazy, right? It's just like all you do is interview a leader. Although it does show, like, it's interesting, like a lot of the anti-free speech arguments are very similar, or the anti-free speech sort of ways of thinking. And this is one of them I think we've seen even in the West at a lower level, maybe, which is if you're interviewing Bob, and Bob is a fascist or communist, that means you must be a fascist or communist, or you must sympathize with him, or at any point.
Or just that you're giving
trouble.
airtime to the fascist or communist, which the authorities don't like, depending on their political leanings.
Yeah, or here, they don't like any kind of Kurdish nationalism. And
Yeah.
so,
So it's more political than religious, the censorship and persecution of journalists and so on.
yeah, I mean, the Kurdish thing is really interesting because, I mean, some people would say, I'm reading a book about the Ottoman Empire that I bought when I was there. And some people would say, actually, under the empire, it was more liberal, just in the sense that when they refounded Turkey as a secular republic, they also founded it on a nationalist basis. So it was the country of the Turks. And that actually, the term Turk was one that Ataturk actually kind of pioneered. It existed before, but he kind of made it into a big thing. And so because of that, now, like, being Kurdish is like not what you're meant to do as a Turk, right? So you can argue that they sort of do, they are kind of related, or the clamping down on Kurdish speech is partly a reflection of this.
Well, in some ways, it's a reflection of the
Yeah,
collapse of a colonizing empire, right? So the heartland was Turkish, but they controlled much of North Africa at times, and certainly the Middle East,
yeah,
and had lots of different ethnicities under their sway, including the Kurds. And then after World War One, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and you're left with Turkey, with some of those ethnic minorities, especially the Kurds, still present, and of course the Armenians who were slaughtered. And so
yeah, that's right.
it,
Armenians,
there's
of
a
course, are
sense in which a
Christians.
falling empire can create ethnic
Yeah,
divisions that weren't there before.
this is very ignorant of me, but the Kurds are Muslims, are they, or is there a
I
religious?
believe so. I
Yeah,
think so.
but definitely
Yeah,
with the Armenians, I think there's that aspect of they're not, and
because they were
obviously
Christians.
Greeks as well. There's a
Yeah.
religious aspect to it. But no, I mean, I think it's interesting. Like a lot of people on the academic left now, I think, are saying, "Oh, the Ottoman Empire was this kind of space of relative liberalism and also meritocracy." So this, that you can find examples of grand viziers who were from Albania, who were Greek, and they grew up poor. And I think what these accounts often conveniently leave out is that this is a product of the diversionary system, which is basically they pluck children from the families of the
Yeah.
empire and they enslave them forcibly. Obviously, that's how enslavement works. And then they do raise them and educate them, and they can, go high up in the system because you basically have like a kind of slave military slash bureaucracy, kind of like the Mamluks, but the Ottomans sort of reformed that system a little bit. But anyway, the point is, it sort of seems nice, like it's a meritocracy. Look, it's sort of multicultural, but it's multicultural because they're enslaving people from all around the empire.
Like the Roman Empire was pretty multicultural as well in that way, right? Lots
Oh,
of
I guess so. I mean,
lots of
yeah,
slaves from all over the empire.
yeah. I mean, at least you can say that with the Ottomans, like you genuinely could make it to the top of that sort of bureaucratic slash military system. Whereas in Rome, you probably weren't going to go. I don't know what's the best example of someone who was a slave who made it,
Well,
pretty
I
high
don't
up.
know
I guess
about slaves, but certainly later in the empire, it was perfectly possible for plebeians to rise. There
yeah,
were
yeah, no,
some,
that's a different thing. But yeah, freedmen, I'm not sure how far you can get. There are definitely examples of sort of very well educated freedmen, like Polybius, the historian, who was captured when the Romans were fighting in Greece. But anyway, let's go back to these journalists in Turkey, because I've also written
yeah,
down between 2014 and 2020, almost 40,000 cases filed for insulting the president. And apparently the figure for the past 5 presidents combined before Erdogan, just 1,716 cases. I mean, obviously, from the perspective of free Kiwis, we would advise the Republic of Turkey not to have on your books some kind of law against insulting the president. That's completely absurd and unacceptable. And like, you're not going to be an actual republic in any sense if you have that on the books. But at least in the past, it wasn't used very often. I mean, still, almost 2,000 cases are too many, but 40,000 in a 6-year period for insulting the president. I mean, that suggests to me that Erdogan has some very, very thin skin.
yeah. So it does sound much more like the case of an autocratic dictator imposing restrictions on free speech than Islamism as such being the issue.
Yeah, and another thing I saw references
Do
to
do
is,
people get censored for religious speech that might go against the tenets
yeah, that's
of
a good
Islam?
question, Michael. I mean, again, I'm sort of new to this topic, but I guess that I would want to look into what all the activities of this office for, what was it called, the DNet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, like what they're up to. But no, most of the cases I saw, I mean, insulting the president, like all those cases, if it's true that there were 40,000 people, sorry, 40,000 cases have been filed against people. I don't know how many of them actually went through, how many people were actually imprisoned. What I said before had another factoid. The number of journalists is only in the hundreds who are in jail. So obviously, not all those cases are getting, bringing people into prison. But still, yeah, those are all for insulting. All those cases are for insulting the president. So that's entirely sort of secular.
Mm.
Um, and Oh yeah, so actually another thing I wrote down is there's a lot of cooperation actually. So this actually brings us back into the territory of Anglophone countries and the West. A lot of the big Western social media companies seem to be complying and cooperating with the Turkish regime. So I read that 85 to 95% of Turkish government censorship requests to X and TikTok are acted upon. So the vast, vast majority of the time that the Turkish state is saying to apparently X and TikTok in particular, you need to take this down because it's insulting the president. Maybe because it's un-Islamic, un-Muslim, I don't know. But for whatever reason, the vast majority of the times that happens, these social media companies in the West are saying sure and taking them down or closing accounts or
It's
whatever.
probably because they're just useless and weak.
Oh, I mean, yes, exactly. And this is a classic thing, isn't it? That they're probably, and this is, X is Elon Musk is saying he's a free speech warrior. So it's classic sort of Western hypocrisy. It's like when the big companies say we're in favor of LGBTQ rights and they have rainbow flags in their logos and stuff. And then people have put, you can juxtapose the logos that they use in Western countries where it's all these rainbow stuff, flags, at least for limited periods. And then the logos that they use at the same time in Saudi Arabia or Iran, and there's no rainbow flag to be seen, right? So it's just
Yeah,
like, well, what are you actually doing for gay and
they're
lesbian
marketing.
people?
They're
Yeah,
marketing.
exactly.
Yeah.
They're
So
catering to the crowd, like they're trying to say to Westerners, we're really helping you guys, but actually when push comes to shove, they're not risking it.
so apart from these journalists who have been jailed, did you notice any pushback against the deliberalization of Turkey?
Sorry, push back
Is there
against.
a Turkish free speech union or anything like that?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'd be very surprised. I think it'd be very, very brave. I mean, there was a BBC journalist I read about who a couple of years ago, I think was arrested and then released. But even foreign journalists are getting into a bit of trouble. Probably has a very, I mean, we're talking at universities about chilling effect, but actually being put in the jail and stuff is something that tends not to happen. Thank goodness. So there's a huge.
No, although we might remember Graham Linehan being arrested at Heathrow
That's true.
Airport
Yeah, I
for a
was actually
tweet.
gonna.
Is the UK is got a very bad record at the moment.
Yeah. No,
for
that's
things
right.
like
That's
that.
something I was going to come back to maybe later, but yeah, we can talk about it a little bit now. I mean, that's also true that there are all these, well, first of all, there's all these non-crime hate incidents, but there are
Yep.
apparently also people who are actually being prosecuted and charged, and in some cases, I guess, put in prison for expression, which is completely bizarre and ludicrous. But one more thing I wrote down about Turkey. So I read a little bit about this guy Ekrem Imamoglu, sorry for the pronunciation, arrested late last year, having already been prosecuted for insulting public officials. And there were big protests, and there was a social media crackdown in response to people kind of posting things about him. But this guy is prominent because I think he's a Kemalist. He seems to be some kind of liberal, and he was the mayor of Istanbul, which obviously is, if you're looking at Turkey from a kind of traditional Islamic perspective, is like the Great Satan, because it's relative. Even if I didn't think it was looked at westernized and liberal compared to the rest of Turkey, it's extremely liberal.
Yep.
As is, I think most of the West Coast is sort of seen as slightly Kemalist. But so to me, this is also very obvious that Erdogan just sees this guy as a rival, and so he wants
Yep.
to get him out of the way. And you can look on Wikipedia. There's all these charges which just seem sort of trumped up, tax evasion. I don't know what they were, but they don't seem very credible.
So I wonder if his ambition to raise a pious generation is really just a political move.
Well, that's also an interesting point because these two. This is sort of again, this is much worse than Western universities, but there's a similar thing at Western universities where it's kind of like, do these people really believe the ideology, or does that just help them? Right, it helps them
Yeah.
stay in the role and become dean or head of school or whatever, and deal
Yeah, it
with.
may be a slightly different dynamic. I mean, and I have no idea, but just from Erdogan's perspective, he might be considering that if you raise a generation who are trained to be unthinkingly religious, then they're also likely not to question too much the political leaders.
Yeah,
If
that
if
that
they're in,
may very well
if
be the
they
case, and
if they're
I
indoctrinated with a religion, then
yeah.
they're going to have their critical thinking faculties quite impaired probably by that, and so that will extend to other forms of authoritarianism.
Yeah, and I haven't studied enough to know whether I mean, I assume that he would be then using his status as kind of a champion of Islam to protect himself against criticism as well. It's sort of
Yep.
interesting to me historically that even though there's that tendency with there must be that temptation with a lot of these Muslim dictators. Maybe not the Ba'athist ones quite, because they're from a kind of Marxist direction, but none of them ever go back to like, refounding the Sultanate or, the Ottoman Empire. Just as in China, like even though it's quite autocratic and top down, no one ever says let's go back full on to the Confucian system and an empire. So it's interesting how, the Western way of looking at states has kind of won the argument to that extent. But of course, there's lots of backsliding, and Turkey's obviously a big example of this.
And also, this is the matter of capability. They're not in a position to reinstate the Ottoman Empire.
Well, okay, they're not in a position to kind of conquer the territory the Ottoman Empire held, but I mean, Erdogan could probably say, I'm going to be Sultan from now on. I'm going to appoint Grand Viziers, or I'm
Oh,
going
I
to be
see.
Grand Vizier and put some kind of
Yeah.
puppet figure above him or something like that. But there's a way in which that just seems absurd, even in a state like Turkey, which under his direction is becoming sort of re-Islamized and more traditional again.
Yeah, I mean, there's a
Um,
potential for it to backfire on him, I suppose, or on his successor if his successor is similarly politically authoritarian. If a younger generation, as they grow up, are much more religious, then they might demand a theocracy.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting from the point of view of liberals like us, sort of the kind of Whiggish persuasion who sort of expect what did Martin Luther King say, that the arc of the moral universe to tend towards justice, or at least maybe in our cases, sort of freedom and democracy. Because and actually, there are more for most of the past 100 years, the lines have gone up in terms of democracy in these three kind of humps.
In Europe, you can say for the last 500 years, there's been a tendency in the liberalizing direction, probably.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not a sort of surefire thing. Let me just talk about one other thing because it's not the New Zealand Initiative. This is the Free Kiwis podcast, but you're at the New Zealand Initiative. I'm still at the New Zealand Initiative, sort of. I'm an adjunct. So the economy also kind of interests me because you can put this to Bryce and Eric and see what they think. So Erdogan apparently is convinced that the way of getting low inflation is to lower interest rates, right? So this is kind of the exact opposite of the economic orthodoxy. Uh, and the result of this is that inflation hit 75 to 85% in, I think, 2022 or 2023. And
So
again,
the
like,
orthodox economics seems to have been vindicated.
exactly. And this, but these are insanely high inflation rates. So you can get online the graph of inflation rates over time, and like, what were we worried about in New Zealand? I mean, we were right to worry
We
about it. Inflation
we hit
was
7 or 8%, I think, and that.
exactly. At
And
some
I
point,
remember when I was a teenager in New Zealand, it was as high as 15% for a while.
yeah.
But
So
yeah, never been anything like 85.
sorry, Michael, I don't want to expose you to the listener, but when exactly was this in the 70s? You were a teenager, or
And I was a teenager in the early 1980s, well, the 1980s in general, but yes, this was the early 1980s.
1980s? Yeah. Oh, okay. I
Yeah.
was thinking inflation was so. I would have thought it would started to come down once you had the 80s revolution, but I guess that's a little bit later than I think. It's like mid
It was
80s.
1984, I think, that
Right, that's when the
the
fourth Labour government comes in. Is it?
that right? Maybe
Yeah, because
1983.
the Thatcherite
Yeah.
revolution's a little bit later than people think as well, isn't it? But anyway,
Yeah, Thatcher, I think, came to power in 1980, so she was a bit ahead of Roger Douglas. But
okay.
yeah,
But you
it
think
was I think
stagflation is a 70s thing, right? In most of in the States and Britain, this
yeah,
combination of low growth and high inflation is more of a
yeah.
but anyway, you're right. Like in those periods at its worst, I think it was sort of 15-20% or something in the West. So it's just insane. Like Turkey today, 75 to 85%. It's come down since then. I think it's sort of now only 20 to 30% because after this period of almost complete sort of collapse of the economy because the inflation was so high, Erdogan appointed central bankers who actually knew what they were doing. And then they raised the official rate. They raised the official rate to like 50%. There's also like
The
insanity
cash
compared
rate.
to, yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. So they compared to what the sort of tweaks that we can get away with in places like New Zealand, our colleagues would argue about, half a percentage point rise and stuff like that. So they really raised it really high. And then inflation goes down, as I said, to only about 30% now. But apparently it's interesting because Erdogan is still sort of not convinced that the economic orthodoxy is correct. And because he's so powerful, he keeps being like, oh, let's lower the interest rate again. And then inflation goes crazy.
Well,
Um,
presumably he'd like to lower the interest rate for populist reasons so that people can borrow more money and feel richer and so on. But
I guess, but
obviously,
they don't feel rich because,
obviously it doesn't work because
yeah.
you're inflating the money supply and you're going to cause inflation.
But I think this also tells us, I mean, this is a lot of lessons tonight in Free Kiwis, but there's a lesson here about I think some people on the alt right now are starting to say, oh, we need to get rid of liberal democracy and have like a monarchy or something. And it's,
Right. Yeah.
and one of the reasons for that is they think the people are stupid. And it's true, like, okay, like a lot of people aren't very intelligent, but a lot of people are smart as well. And the point is, if you have an actual absolute sole ruler, in theory, the idea is you get someone who's incredibly virtuous and intelligent and always makes the right decision. But actually, in practice, you often end up with a dummy. And we've seen this, we see this in several countries at the moment. But Erdogan, I mean, doesn't know what he's doing with the economy, and he's the most powerful person in the country. And the result is that you're screwed. You have to deal with 80% inflation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these kind of utopian ideas or populist ideas or wherever they may come from, they they're very seductive. I mean, it's a bit like communism. To the naive ear, it sounds great. Everyone will have the same, and it'll all be, some kind of workers' paradise, etc. Uh, and it has this superficial veneer of justice about it, but we know what the history tells us about its effects. So
Exactly. It's the same whether it's communism or fascism or,
yeah,
you're going to be a perfectly virtuous Muslim state or a perfectly virtuous Christian state, right?
but it does remind us not only Turkey, but what's been happening in the UK and elsewhere in the West and in the US, how fragile the liberal order is. And we've discussed this before. It's hard to maintain. It doesn't rest on kind of instinctual human behaviors. In fact, a whole lot of human propensities cut in the opposite direction. And so if we don't maintain it actively, liberal democracy, then we will lose it. So now you're in England, having travelled from Japan, well, from New Zealand to Japan to Turkey. So we talked a little bit before about how free speech has been under attack in the UK, but things have got pretty bad there.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm still catching up with it. I'm sort of looking forward to getting stuck in and going to some UK Free Speech Union meetings and figuring out what's up. But of course, we see the lurid headlines and lurid posts on social media. I never know quite how far to trust those because I see a lot of things about England. You know, when I said I was coming back here, people in New Zealand were saying, "Oh, London's terrible." And I haven't had my phone snatched yet, for example.
Right.
Social
Yeah,
media
yeah.
makes me think that
But
it's like
you've only been there, what, 3 days? So give
only
it
been a few
time.
days. But anyway, of course, now that I've said this online, it's going to happen tomorrow. But you know, so there's a possibility for some exaggeration. But um, I have looked up some things about free speech in the UK to help me catch up, and I have this figure of 1,000 arrested each year for social media posts. Um, and again, you know, that doesn't mean that they're all being prosecuted or that there's a conviction in every case. But if that figure is anywhere near right, it's pretty outrageous. There should be zero
There should
arrests
be
for
zero,
social media
and
posts.
being arrested is a punishment in itself, whether you've done
Yeah.
anything wrong or not.
Well, actually, I mean, let's back up. There should be a very small number of arrests for social media posts each year relating to posts which are clearly, you know,
Actual
imminent
threats.
threat, you know,
Yeah.
of violence or orders to underlings to commit violence, something of that nature, or like
Or
obvious
espionage or whatever.
terrorist attacks or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these are actually posts about controversial subjects like transgender movement and who knows what else. Um, so the Online Safety Act came in, I think, mid 2024. There's several pieces of legislation that play a role here. There's the Communications Act. I think that goes all the way back to 2003. That already made illegal messages. I actually looked this one up because I read a summary of it and I thought that can't be right. I think it was AI summary and I thought I'm gonna actually look into this because it said something like it criminalized messages that were indecent, obscene, or menacing. And I looked up the language of the Communications Act 2003. I found the actual section 127, and it does actually say that you could be in trouble for messages that are, quote, indecent, obscene, or menacing in nature, or if they are intended to cause annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety. I can't remember exactly how it's framed, but those things shouldn't be anywhere near law on freedom of expression.
They certainly shouldn't. I mean, quite apart from the fact that it's marginal harm being
Yeah.
caused, it's extremely subjective what those things mean.
I mean, what's needless anxiety? I mean, if you're like a hippie or a
Yeah.
Buddhist or something, it's all anxiety is needless, right?
Well, that's true. And if you're a highly strung wokester, then suffering from anxiety is almost a constant.
Yeah, so I mean, this goes back to 2003, I think. So I imagine that when they brought this in, they weren't dealing yet with the sort of fully fledged or social media in its fully fledged form. So they're probably thinking of direct communications like texts, you know, insulting texts that are insulting or cause anxiety or something. Even then, of course, it's a stupid law.
It's
It's a ridiculous
absurd.
law. It shouldn't be a law in a supposedly free country like the UK.
And
Again,
gee, that's a long time ago too. I didn't realize they'd been so
yeah.
bad for so long.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I mean, it's sort of like when we were writing against the ratcheting up of the hate speech laws in New Zealand. You know, we discovered to our horror, and maybe you knew already, that there were actually already hate speech laws on the books, and they were already really dumb and
Yeah.
unmanageable and unworkable. It's just that they weren't actually implemented because,
They've hardly ever been used.
yeah, because we lived at a time we thought, you know, when I was growing up in the 90s, 2000s in New Zealand and most Anglophone countries, people basically understood liberalism and free speech, and they knew that that kind of law was kind of stupid. And that's why there were also sort of blasphemy laws on the books in places like Ireland, right? And they didn't have to
Yeah.
formally take these laws away until later. Thankfully, they've taken away most of the blasphemy laws. But those other laws, which were kind of sleeper
They-
or zombie laws, they've
They've
come
introduced
back to the
new
effect.
blasphemy laws instead.
What?
They've introduced new blasphemy laws instead.
Well, exactly. So anyway, and then there's the Scottish Hate Crimes Act of 2024, and that's obviously north of the border. But they seem to be sort of leading the way in sort of clamping down on speech from this direction. And with some cases, actually, you mentioned earlier, of so high-profile cases of people who are arrested for social media posts. Graham Linehan, who's actually a previous Free Kiwis guest, Yeah, he was actually arrested for, what was the tweet about? Probably
It
transgender.
was about trans stuff. It always is with him,
Almost
isn't it?
inevitably. No, no, Graham. I actually think he posts too much on that topic, to be perfectly honest. But like, it's his right to do that. I mean, some people post,
It's not a criminal offense to do too much.
I post too much about antiquarianism.
Quite. Well, no, just the right
Exactly,
amount,
you
but
meant to
still.
disagree with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they shouldn't be locked up for it. So Lucy
Yeah.
Connolly is a big name,
Well,
sentenced
she went to jail for what, a year?
31 months. It says here she was sentenced to. I don't
Yeah.
know how much she actually has served. I think she's still serving it. She's
No, she's out. She's out. But
okay. You know
yeah.
more than me. Yeah. So I mean that's kind of the legal framework, and there's all these non-hate crime incidents. I think that's a very messy picture, but it seems that they actually won the Free Speech Union and other groups actually won legal victories trying to get rid of these. And I think people have even been instructed in the police force to get rid of these. And I think there are still non-crime hate incidents, I think, being recorded. It's astonishing. It's kind of like, reminds me of Guantanamo Bay or something. It's sort of
Yeah.
everybody, Obama came in and said, I'm going to get rid of this. And it just couldn't, for some reason, happen. And it's the same with these non-hate crime incidents.
Well, they
Non-crime.
tell the police to stop doing it and they keep doing it anyway, it would
Yeah, I
seem.
know. It's amazing, like the hold that this ideology has. I mean, the sense I get is that there's been just years of people in police forces and other institutions having trainings from people basically telling them, giving them, sort of feeding them illiberal views, an illiberal view of what policing is, a very unbalanced view of what policing is. And so it's very difficult to sort of deracinate that once it's part of the system, I imagine.
Mm. It's interesting going back to what you were saying just before about how New Zealand and other countries as well have had hate speech laws on their books for a long time, and I think New Zealand's came in something like the 1980s originally. Um, and I remember when I was an undergraduate in Australia, they were mooting the same thing there, and it's a sign of how much the times have changed. That back then, the hate speech laws that they wanted to adopt, which were you know, pretty bad, but pretty mild by the standards of the kinds of things that they want to introduce now, were met with outrage.
Yeah, especially by students, right?
Absolutely, by students.
And
Yes,
artists
yeah.
and journalists and stuff, which makes perfect
And
sense.
I remember the feeling when I read about it. I thought, what? You want to regulate what people can say?
Yeah.
And it just seems so beyond the pale. It would have been 1987 or 8 or something like that.
Yeah. And now the establishment has largely embraced these sort of liberal ideas. It's really astonishing. I saw something on a Free Speech Union UK newsletter recently about Toby Young, Lord Young, another former guest on Free Kiwis. Everyone who comes on Free Kiwis, later kind of becomes prominent. It's amazing. They might have become prominent first. Okay. But I think Toby Young was saying that they're going to launch some kind of campaign, or he's going to try as a member of the House of Lords to basically get rid of hate crimes from British legislation, which sounds like a tall order considering how apparently kind of nested it is in these institutions. But I
I
think
don't
I
think
think
the
that's the
House
kind of
of
thing we
Lords
need to
has
be.
much.
What's that?
The House of Lords doesn't have too much say over
No, that's right.
legislation, does it?
That's right. So
Yeah.
I mean, good luck to him. I mean, genuinely, but I mean, it's going to be a tall order. There's a determined man. He's got lots of Free Speech Union UK has a lot of members. Actually, that's one interesting thing that since this new Labour government has come in, the Free Speech Union membership has exploded, apparently. I mean, it's gone up by tens of thousands. Not to say that there were no problems with free speech under the previous Conservative government, of course, because that's when a lot of these non-crime hate incidents were being recorded, and we're in this mess partly because they didn't do anything or they made it worse. But people are even more scared apparently now that Keir Starmer's in. So I think that Toby Young's inclination is the right one. Like I think we need now to go on the counterattack and to think about how we got to the situation. We can no longer be blasé about really bad legislation just being around. I mean,
Yeah.
one thing I also have said for a long time now is I think in Anglophone countries like Canada and the UK, Australia, New Zealand, like when we were growing up, or when I was growing up, I just sort of thought, well, it doesn't really matter what the legal framework is. I mean, it matters to some extent, but it's not so important because everybody just understands so well. Everybody's just so thoroughly imbued with liberal values, and we understand that free speech is important, that nothing's going to go too terribly wrong. So we don't really need a First Amendment like they have in the States. Now I think what we should be pushing for is some kind of it's more difficult to entrench legislation in countries where parliament is sovereign and supreme, but we need some kind of entrenched legislation which becomes part of a sort of quasi basic law or whatever, what countries have in the year of a written constitution or a limited written constitution. We need some kind of statute that's sort of extra strong and durable that actually, you know, tilts things in favor of liberalism and free speech rather than censorship.
Yeah, the trouble is you need a two-thirds majority in, well, the New Zealand Parliament at any rate to get an entrenchment.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I guess you're right. It's difficult, and you're right to sort of raise these very practical difficulties. I mean, Toby Young's going to have trouble too, but I think that's what we kind of need to be thinking about as a movement. And the thing is, it could be one of these moments when things get so bad that it really galvanizes. I think it has sort of galvanized people, and hopefully we can use some of that momentum. I mean, the problem is that we're fighting so many battles on so many fronts. But yeah, at some point we need to try and actually fix things. Um, anyway, that's all I had to say about free speech in the UK. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about since I've been here. I'm in London now, but I've just spent the last month in Dorset, where I grew up in Canada and Canadian Army bases till I was 12. But after I was 12 and I came to England, the time I spent in England was always in Dorset. So that's kind of a home for me. And it's kind of interesting to hear people talk about things there. I mean, Sherborne, where my parents live, is very much a retirement community. Well, it's got schools and basically retirees. And so, I mean, one of the things people are talking about is Rachel Reeves, the Labour Chancellor's changes to inheritance tax. And the important thing to know there apparently is there's a 7-year limit. So if you're a retiree and you give your children or your relatives gifts, and that's within 7 years, then you pay tax. And
I mean, 7 years, you die within 7 years, they
that's
pay
right. If you
tax on the
die within
gift.
70,
Yeah.
7 years, you pay tax at various rates, and it kind of goes up through the years. But if it's within that 7 year band, you get taxed. And I think if it's within 3 years, it's 40%, and that goes down to 8% in the 6th year. And then after it's outside the 7-year band, it's 0% inheritance
So
tax.
that's the
You get other
percentage of the percentage of the tax that you would have to pay
the percentages.
had
So
you
it's, let's
had
say
you
like
had you died before giving the money.
it's
You
something
pay
like,
that
say my mother
percentage.
gives me a gift of £100,000, and
Yeah.
then she dies next year. Horrific thought, but my mother dies next year or two, or within the next 7 years. Then for £40,000 goes to the government. Well, if that's within
Wow.
3 years, I should say. Yeah, yeah,
So
exactly. So it's a big
so
inheritance tax
so
fall.
if you don't give the gift and you just leave it in your will, what's the tax rate then?
Well, then that's inheritance tax too.
Yeah, how much? What's the rate of the inheritance tax?
So then it's 40% because that's within
40%.
0 to 3 years.
40%. Wow, that's a
Yeah,
very big chunk.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, the Labour government's a socialist government, and I think there is an argument that there shouldn't be you shouldn't be able to pass all your money on because it sort of entrenches inequality or something. But a lot of people think they've gone too far. Anyway, there's a lot of, as with all legislation that the government puts through, people are trying to get around it in various ways. Mostly various legal ways, but people are thinking very hard
Yeah.
about.
If
And
I
it's a
was a
little
younger
grotesque because
if I
people
was a
sort of think,
younger person, I'd feel disgusted by that because it may be the only way you're ever going to be able to afford a house is through inheritance.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, with Britain and England especially, I mean, there's a lot of sort of class warfare. So, I mean, another complaint of people in that area of Dorset where my parents live and where I went to school, there's a very good state school called the Griffin, and then there's actually two private schools in the town and one just outside the town. And another thing Rachel Reeves has done is changed the tax status of independent schools. And so
Oh.
there's VAT and it's much more expensive. Fees are much higher, basically, in effect. So, I mean, on the labor side, they're sort of saying, well, who cares? These are posh people, they're privileged and they can afford to not go to independent school. But of course, the people who are getting taxed see this partly really is an attack on their way of life, I suppose. Maybe that's hyperbolic, but I think that's the way a lot of people see it. in that part of the country. And there's a similar thing going on with farming. I mean, it's a little bit different in terms of the class structure because a lot of farmers aren't that prosperous, but farms are often, in order to be a viable farm, you have to have, I don't know how many acres or hundreds of acres, but they're usually quite sizable. So the nominal value of farms can be quite high.
Mm.
And so here there's inheritance tax as well. So that 40% inheritance tax would apply to farms. And the government said initially we're going to cap, there's tax relief for farms. So instead of paying 40%, they pay 20%. And originally the Labour government said we're going to cap that at £1 million total value. And then when I was in England last year, actually, there were all these protests. And so they've actually upped the limit to 2.5 million per person. You still get tax relief. So basically, again, the Labour government is saying this only really affects, you only get like a big chunk out of your farm value taken away if you're very, very wealthy. These farms have to be worth, per person 2.5 million. So per couple, it's 5 million. But then on the other side, a lot of people, like even the National Union of Farmers, is saying, well, actually, that's still quite a large number of people because farms are different to houses, ordinary property, in that they're very large and the nominal value is very high, but it doesn't mean the farmers are necessarily rich, right? You can have lots of
Right.
acres and you can
Yeah.
be making tiny margins on it. You're never really going to be able to sort of sell the land or anything. So that's not the way it works. That's their argument.
And it's kind of useful for the state to have lots of food being produced, even if the farmers are not getting a great return on their capital.
Yeah, although of course, someone like Eric would say, why not just produce the food in India and fly it in, right? If it's cheaper.
Well, that's true, or
But
New Zealand for that matter. But
that's the thing. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean,
that's where you run into the politics of protectionism, though, right?
yeah, I mean, this is the thing with European societies, especially. Okay, Canada has a lot of agricultural protectionism as well, as Eric will tell you. But I think especially in countries like England, there's this very strong sense in certain parts of society, by no means all, the parts of society that tend to vote Tory traditionally, that say, no, no, this is actually a way of life. The countryside has a certain shape because of farms, and we need to keep farming, otherwise it'll change in nature. The fox hunting thing has come up again as well
Yeah.
actually recently, which was, I think, banned by the Tony Blair government when I was at school, but there are various loopholes and hasn't really been fully implemented. And so that's kind of sprung up again because the new Labour government wants to sort of finally stamp it out. And various people are still conducting hunts. I think the usual thing people say is, well, we're actually just having the dogs chase some kind of a sort of artificial rabbit or a bunch of food or something. I'm not really sure. But then critics say that actually at some point the dogs will start hunting a fox if it's in the vicinity, and at that point the hunt will basically just throw its hands up, but it's still illegal. So yeah.
It does start to sound like they just want to hurt them, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, they want to save the foxes, right? They're
Well, so they say, but I find that pretty far-fetched that they're
well,
using
that's
an
because
artificial.
you lack empathy because you're a terrible man.
Obviously, I'm vegetarian. I have no empathy for animals at all.
That's a that's a good point. Yeah, no, but I mean, this is what they say. I guess it's like the poor
I
fox.
don't believe them. What I'm saying is, I don't believe them that it happens in any great amount, and that using an artificial rabbit, they should bloody well leave them alone and let them do it.
Oh yeah, no, I think that yeah, you're allowed to use an artificial rabbit. It's just that sometimes I think they end up hunting a real animal, and
Right.
and
But
then they sort of shrug their
your
shoulders.
domestic dog could do that too when you're out with it in the countryside.
It must be reasonably hard to implement, and it's one of those things. If you've seen a hunt go by in the English countryside, there's a lot of people involved. So it'd be the kind of thing that you need a lot of testicles as a copper to, especially if you come from the local area, probably you kind of know a lot of people involved. And I mean, they should do that. I mean, that's the law. I actually think you should implement laws that are. I think this also about cannabis in New Zealand. Like, I think that they should not have laws against cannabis anywhere, but if there are laws against cannabis, you should actually implement them. Whereas
Well,
in New
it's a good
Zealand,
argument for getting rid of stupid laws, isn't it? If you're going to
yeah,
have a
yeah,
law implement it. I mean, we were talking about blasphemy laws before, and I
yeah,
think New Zealand got rid of its only wiped it finally off the books like 20 years ago or something like that,
yeah,
even though it hadn't been prosecuted for half a century or more.
yeah.
So,
Of course, it's not always an argument that a law is difficult to implement to get it off the books because people are still committing murder It doesn't mean it's, oh, it's too hard to implement. Let's get rid of the laws against murder. But
No, it's not a matter of hard to implement. It's a matter of not bothering because nobody thinks it should be a crime.
yeah, and then there's an interesting, well, that's the thing about cannabis. Like, I actually think there's a class element here too. I'm all about class tonight, apparently, because it's sort of
It's
like
because you're in England.
they actually tested that idea that everybody in New Zealand was fine with smoking pot in the referendum. Like I would
Yeah.
have, and I expected in the referendum, that was 2023, was it?
Yeah, it's because the Green Party was championing it, and they did so very poorly.
But anyway, for people
They,
who don't
they
know,
ran a very bad campaign on it. So
didn't
yeah,
pass.
no,
So,
it only missed out by 1% or something. But yeah,
but yeah, I mean, there is a problem if you're actually prosecuting people lower down the pecking order for kind of bogan drugs or kind of lower class seeming drugs like P, meth, and you're not prosecuting people who are bankers when they're taking cocaine, even though they're both illegal. People are going to cry foul. That's all I'm saying. I wouldn't
yeah,
actually, I wouldn't actually have laws against any of these things. I would have regulation. But
yeah.
yeah. Okay. Final thing that people are talking about in North Dorset that I was talking to, pubs also. People think that the Labour government is sort of are attacking pubs. Again, because of tax.
Aren't pubs a good working class institution that they should be trying to, you know,
Yeah, I mean
support so that the red
exactly.
wall comes back?
Yeah, that's what you'd think. Yeah, the red one. And that was the sort of old labor movement. It was like the working man, the man of the people, and
All the old trade unions would always meet at the pub, wouldn't they?
yeah, it'd probably be smoke filled. And of course, in the old days, they
Yeah.
didn't know smoking so bad for you. And we've learned more maybe about alcohol. But actually, as I was writing in the New Zealand Initiative newsletter a while back, moderate drinking still seems to be quite good for you. Not
Or at least not terribly bad. I think they've revised the
actually like
research a bit.
positively good for you. Like moderate drinking is better for you than being a teetotaler.
I think that's been overturned, but
No,
I
no,
think,
you have to go. Well, talk to Eric and read my column on the J-shaped curve because
all right.
Eric and I actually looked into it when I wrote that article, and there's a lot of good, very sort of large end studies conducted by like the American government back before it was crazy. Um, and no, it does seem like this J-shaped curve is still a thing where the harms from drinking are a little bit higher when you're a teetotaler, then they go down, and then after like 1 to 3 units of alcohol a day, they go up again quite rapidly.
Right.
But
Okay.
anyway, but what I was trying to say is just that nowadays on the left, as we know, because of other things we've discussed on Free Kiwis, there's this strange Puritanism that's crept in. But anyway, business rates are now higher for pubs, so a lot of them are struggling to say they're going to have to close. But also other businesses, other entertainment businesses and leisure and what's the word? Hospitality. That's what I'm looking for. Hospo, as they'd say in New Zealand. And so now they're thinking of, and so one thing about this Labour government is that, well, the critics say, and they're, I mean, this is accurate, whether you like Keir Starmer or not and his agenda, there's a lot of U-turns, right? So they also did a U-turn on this, and they looked like they're going to, and they're saying maybe we'll have an exemption for pubs so we can save pubs. But then, of course, everybody else in the hospitality industry is like, well, I'm technically a restaurant, even though I kind of do the same thing as a pub. So then you're going
Yeah.
to begin, whenever there's exemptions in taxation, like people in the initiative talk about this with sales taxes as well. As soon as
Yeah,
you
it happened in Australia when they introduced GST. They decided fresh food wouldn't be taxed, but processed food would. And then there were endless arguments about whether, if you bought a donut from the supermarket versus from the baker, it was fresh or not, and
yeah,
blah, 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 blah.
you have to
Yeah,
have court cases about whether Jaffa cakes are cakes or biscuits and stuff like that.
that kind of shit.
So yeah, so people saying why exemptions for the pubs? Why do they get a special deal? And then also, there was help for pubs and for hospitality during COVID. That's all ended finally. I was actually kind of amazed to see that people were saying, "Oh, that's ending now." And I'm like, surely that should have ended like 4 years ago. But anyway, and
Or
also
never been
alcohol. I
implemented
think there
at
is
all.
that neo-Puritanism thing, higher alcohol duties as well as part of this picture. So I don't know if Keir Starmer hates pubs per se, but I definitely think there's a strain of Puritanism in the Labour Party, and that's not helping. Um, but yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because I actually sort of have done this little segment as if there was just Labour and the Tories as usual, and rural England was kind of a Tory heartland. North Dorset actually, or West Dorset, I think is the constituency, is actually a Liberal Democratic seat at the moment. So things are always a bit more complicated in the West Country. but also, of course, there's reform is making a huge headway, and maybe I need to go to bed soon, but maybe we can just close on this because I think there's some unsavory elements in reform, no doubt about it. But I also think that in the democratic system, if parties don't pay attention to what people are talking about and what their concerns are, they get
That's where you end up.
as in business, you get new entrants who will offer services or goods that aren't being offered by anybody else. And I think the main thing that reform are catering to is concern about immigration. I think some of that is hyperbolic, but that's what they want to speak to that issue, and people want them to speak to that issue. But I also actually think that the culture wars plays a role here. I think that the Tories were far too liable just to sort of go along with what the elites in London were doing. I mean, it sounds kind of conspiratorial, but I just mean like the bourgeois, the educated class, as we saw in universities, they all suddenly, and David Rosado's work has documented this, they all suddenly started
Yeah,
using these new terms and thinking in a certain way, becoming very illiberal on free speech, on freedom of thought, freedom of expression. And and I think that the Tories are used to being the establishment, and that became the new establishment, this wokeness, this extreme progressivism. And so the Tories kind of went that way. And they're
they just kind of
trying to,
adopted it.
I think Kemi Badenoch's trying to bring things back, but it looks like it's too late. And so,
Although I do think, like, I've been watching the UK polls, and Reform peaked a few months ago in the low 30s, and now they're down in the high 20s. They're still much more popular than either Labour or the Tories, but they have come off their high a little bit, and the Conservatives have come back up somewhat.
yeah,
Conservatives are now ahead of Labour, but both of them are below 20%.
but I mean, I'm no political strategist, but I would definitely say if you're the Tories or if you're Labour, really, I really don't think that this neo-Puritanism is that popular, and I think
No,
it's coming from top down, and I also, from okay, it's coming from a set of society which is very influential in the media and academia, and it thus sort of lulls politicians into thinking it's more widely espoused than it is. So I really think that really the vote-rich areas are actually being liberal, defending liberal democracy, defending free speech.
yep, I tend to agree. So shall we close with some news from New Zealand?
Oh, sorry, I've been very selfish this whole thing. I just talked.
No, that's all right. Well, there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning. One is that our Broadcasting Standards Authority has decided to extend its own brief. I don't know if you heard about that before you left or during your travels, but they
Yes.
decided they decided that they should have jurisdiction over online sources of media, not just broadcast media or print media. And so the platform and Reality Check Radio and some of those other online new media sources are understandably upset about this because they were not previously under the jurisdiction of the Broadcasting Standards Authority. And it's likely to come to a court case, I would say, because the BSA doesn't seem to be backing down. And I can be pretty sure that Sean Plunkett from the platform won't back down. So I'm expecting there to be a legal fight over that at some point, which the BSA should lose because it's very clear that they are not legislatively empowered to regulate online media sources.
Yeah, that
So that,
story did break just before I left, and I think one question that people might ask is if the Broadcasting Standards Authority is correct that it had jurisdiction over the interwebs all this time. The interwebs isn't a new thing, right? It's been around for a while. Did
yeah.
they were they clamping down on websites prior to last year?
Well, the answer is no. In fact, they explicitly said that they didn't have jurisdiction over websites. I can't remember how many years ago, but it was a while ago.
Okay, and
So
are they
they've reversed themselves on that, and it's clear that they don't, but they're trying to grab that power.
right? So are they clamping down? So it just I don't want to be cynical, but it seems like if they're clamping down on what is it, Free Speech Union, Reality Check Radio,
The
I don't
the
think
platform,
the
the Free
platform.
Speech Union isn't
I
a
actually think a lot of
yeah
those groups are actually just in favor of free speech, but
yeah.
let's be frank, it's obvious that they're more associated with the political right. So are the BSA also clamping down on groups associated with the political left?
In theory, they might if they had that power, but there's been no intimation that they would.
Okay, well, because then people are going to think maybe it's just about politics and they're a bit biased, but
I think it's pretty obviously that myself.
I don't know, maybe people can write in if they come across groups or websites or platforms, I guess I should say, that are more on the left, and the BSA is taken
Yeah.
aim, but I haven't heard of any yet.
The other thing that's happened, which I found out recently about courtesy of our free speech union, which I have to say does a really good job. I think internationally our free speech union is probably the best. Not to detract from the UK one, which I know is probably the oldest, and it does good work. But I think we've done a really good job in New Zealand of heading things off at the pass. We haven't had these non-crime hate incident uh, things in New Zealand, largely because the FSU cracked down on the police who were starting to train their officers in that way. Uh, we saw off the hate speech laws a few years ago. You and I were heavily
Yeah,
involved in that, and
hence, yeah,
they're still very vigilant, and we need them very much. And they at the moment they're calling out something called the Telecommunications Amendment Bill, which would mandate uh, international uh, websites and media online media sources uh, to hoover up information on behalf of the New Zealand government about their users, and it's an assault on encryption. And the legislation says that they could be shut out of the New Zealand internet if they don't comply. So there's a kind of kill switch clause in it. So obviously, that's terrible from a free speech perspective because again, it's surveillance and an attack on privacy, and also potentially cuts down on the number of channels that are available to New Zealanders to use if either they are shut out because they fall foul of this legislation, or they just decide to withdraw because they don't want to comply with it.
so what are
So
the
that's an
proponents of
on.
this legislation saying? Like, they must be saying something like, "Oh, we're going to gather data, but it's going to be not personal data or something."
Well, actually, it hasn't been reported at all in the mainstream media that I've seen. So the Free Speech Union did well to uncover it before it just kind of slipped quietly through Parliament. And they ended up getting hundreds of submissions on it. So the select committee will take place pretty soon. And I'm sure that free speech members will front up at select committee to talk about it.
So who originated this legislation in Parliament?
That's a good question. I don't know who actually drafted it, but it's obviously government legislation. So
Because I mean, I was getting a little bit worried about certain tendencies within National, the more conservative ways of thinking within National started to sort of lean in the direction of censorship.
yeah, there's a bit of that. It's the idea of a social media ban is for young people is being thought about. They haven't done anything on that front yet, but they might. Um, Fortunately, we have ACT in government who would probably oppose all of this, but there's no guarantee that that would stop it going through because National might just get support from Labor or the Greens to do that stuff.
Mhm.
So that's a brief summary of what's going on this side of the world. But again, I think our free speech union is doing a superlative job in seeing these things coming and really stamping on them before they go through.
Yeah, sorry, did you mention there the what's the group that regulates the internet? I should know because I'm actually a member.
Internet New Zealand.
That's right, yeah. So
Yeah.
do they have a stake in this? Because I know that, well, there was a lot of concern, I think, this year or last year that they had sort of been captured and it was no longer about regulating the internet. It was going to start to be about substantive conceptions of social justice, which of course most of New Zealand society doesn't share. Um, but that seems to be still going on. They still are quite captured, I believe, right? Or that, I mean, that's what we would say.
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan Ayling, the previous chief executive of the Free Speech Union, is now sitting on the Internet New Zealand board. So at least, the free speech advocates have an ear in that room. But
Yeah.
uh, he's only one person amongst many. I don't know what the overall composition of that group is, that board is like now.
Yeah, that all seemed very dangerous to me. I mean, if people are concerned by that, we probably said this before, but you can still join Internet New Zealand. I mean, that's why I'm a member. and you can vote on things as they come up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I
Well,
better
very
go to
good.
bed.
You do that, and we'll reconvene in due course. But it's thank you all, audience, for listening. This is the first of perhaps a number of episodes that will take place across 12,000 odd kilometers of distance.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think next time maybe I'll give you a more sort of capital centric view, because I've given you kind of the view from a sort of leafy part of Dorset, leafy part of the country. So next time we'll give you a more urban view. And there may be, speaking of urban
Excellent.
views, there may be soon a video on the New Zealand Initiative website, hopefully, from me with a mustache in Japan, doing an update on what's going on politically in Japan and economically.
Very good.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Michael.
Outstanding. All right. We'll see you next time.